Yes.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great. We're not going to talk too much today about how to find those relationships or to create those relationships. We do cover that on coffee hour. We could do that separately, and we could if we have time to touch on it. But I want to talk about just the legal contractual relationship once you enter into those. Okay, so hopefully, Raven, at the end, if we have time, we'll be more than happy to discuss that. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Just a gentle reminder, I'm starting with the very, very basics, but contracts are promises enforceable by law. And there are several definitions of what a contract is. And you'll see cases where a verbal contract is an agreement. And so definition, of course, of a contract is an agreement between the private parties. And in order for it to be enforceable, it has to meet these certain conditions. It has to be mutual assent, which means both parties agree. It has to have a valid offer and acceptance. It has to have adequate consideration, and especially in the government, the government cannot receive anything for free. So if you're going to provide your services, it's in exchange for some kind of consideration, generally financial, but it could be other things. So adequate consideration. Capacity, are you legally capable of providing that service, and the legality of that arrangement. So, of course, that being a contract, we all know that could be you signing up for a credit card. It could actually be a verbal agreement based on a handshake by the definition. In federal contracts, and rightly so, because, and what I preach here today is everything as to what it really means. And that's where we always get into trouble, is when there's a conflict and we don't have the terms clearly defined. So I recommend, of course, everything be in writing, and federal contracts does require that. If you're looking for our definitions, it's going to say that it is, again, repeating most of those, a mutually binding legal relationship, obligating the seller to furnish the supplies or services and the buyer, the government, to pay for them. But they add that it has to be in writing. So the government's very clear that we don't do anything verbally. If you don't have a written contract, you don't have an agreement. Which is a slight difference. And sometimes it creates that conflict where sometimes vendors will say, well, I got an order and it wasn't in writing, but the government received the services and somebody signed for them. And of course, that is called an unauthorized commitment, because the government clearly states it has to be in writing, but it did, in fact, you did in fact provide a service that was received and the benefit was given to the government. So of course that we have to process those a little bit differently, but they don't like them. So the reason I bring this up is because you are going to get a contract from, the prime's going to get a contract. Government's very clear. We don't do anything unless you get a contract and it's in paper and it's in writing and we've all agreed. The primes then have the responsibility to issue subcontracts. And if you're a big business, even the small businesses need to understand this. You as the prime contract have all that information, or if you are becoming a subcontractor, the prime will pass all that information onto you in writing. And this is where I see the biggest conflict for most of the small businesses. Is that you fail to pass that down. You fail to continue that writing relationship, passing on the terms and conditions that you're responsible for. And hopefully today, one of my communication, or what I communicate to you, is going to be that then you become responsible instead of being in this legally, this triangle of all these relationships, because we do flow down and we do have some commitment. We do include the prime contract. Is that if you break that chain, if you do not put your subcontract lower tier in writing, then you are responsible for making those determinations, and your lower tier subs are not. So I know that's kind of confusing at the moment. Hopefully we'll get into that a little bit. So again, federal contracts, well, all contracts should be in writing, okay? In federal contracts, and to a certain degree, state contracts are going to define. Here's what I want to point out is that in the federal system and the FAR, the government refers to a subcontract as any agreement, okay, any contract. So they use the word interchangeable. I get a lot, as a contracts manager for a large construction firm, I get a lot of subs coming back saying, I'm not a subcontractor, because in their term, the definition is somebody that builds something. Especially if you are a subcontractor, you carry tools of the trade, and you build something. And they say, I'm not a subcontractor. Well, in the federal contracting world, the government refers to everybody and every document. If you issue any kind of written agreement, they refer to it as a subcontract. So don't be confused by that. If you are providing any service, whether you consider yourself a service provider or a vendor, you are a subcontractor in the government's mind. So as you're reading these terms and you're understanding these terms, just realize that you can't say, oh, that doesn't apply to me because I'm not a subcontractor, I'm a vendor, okay? So understanding that, how does that equate? Well, that equates to you're going to have subcontractors by definition are generally performing physical work on site. You're going to have service providers. Those are also different wages versus the subcontractors, which are generally Davis-Bacon. They're generally construction type workers. Service providers, professional services, testing, layout, they don't have to be formal A&E services, but there are a lot of services, even people providing water on site or IT services, those type of things. Then you have suppliers. Suppliers are vendors. They don't actually show up on site, they just provide something off the shelf or custom made, but they're supplying supplies, materials, equipment, rental. They may not ever show up to the government site, construction site or otherwise where services might be provided, but they're providing the material, the labor, the material, the equipment, the rental equipment. They might provide pencils, papers. I mean, if you're a supplier or a vendor, in the government's eyes, you're a subcontractor and all of the requirements will apply. We also have then consultants who think that, well, I don't really fall into the service provider, but I'm a consultant. I don't actually provide a service, I just provide an opinion. Well, again, those are covered. And then we do have other categories like shipping and delivery, trucking, rental equipment. Those are people that just provide, again, not necessarily a product like material and supplies, but they provide a service, but they are, again, shipping and delivering. They don't fall into any of these categories. How that generally equates now, where we're headed with this, is what kind of legal document, and they all vary. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today and help you understand how to navigate some of these and what you should be looking for. So how does that equate for us? And I'm taking this off of my government experience and off of my experience as the contracts manager now for a large construction firm, is that yes, you have subcontracts. And again, we're following that theme that subcontracts are firms that are providing physical work. It could be even asbestos removal. It could be building. It could be pouring concrete. These are all subcontracts. And generally, we break those down into, and now you'll notice that we put service providers, we cover those under subcontracts. Sometimes you'll see them as a subcontract for services. Sometimes you'll see them called services agreement. They kind of fall into the same category of a subcontract. Usually, in my case, we break those down into a long form or a short form. And I just want to familiarize you with both of those types of terms and both of those types of documents, because long forms, of course, are exactly what they say. They're very long. They're very detailed. Short forms are rather short and sweet. And if your services are limited or low risk, you want to try to get into that format. But I'm going to teach you, or hopefully instill upon you, what you're looking for in those documents, and then what is hidden that you want to be aware of. And then services, of course, are also a different type of subcontract or agreement. That's where the kind of rides the fence on what people call them. Generally, they are Service Act wages. They are generally professional type services, and they will also include terms that we're going to talk about as making sure that you're licensed or you're qualified to provide those services, and some liability rules, professional liability, but we'll talk about that. Then you'll find different types of orders or contract documents between purchase orders and purchase agreements. And I didn't see any suppliers, if I recall, none of you are suppliers, but purchase orders are generally referred to for what we call COTS, commercial off-the-shelf products. And the reason I'm talking about this is when you're providing the services, you may in fact have to require yourself, or your services will include you buying some supplies or COTS on behalf of the client and then charging the client. You will actually have to issue a purchase order and flow that down if there are any clauses. We're going to talk about that. So while you may fit into a services subcontract, which I think most of you do, you may end up having to buy some materials for that contract. You would then have to issue a purchase order on behalf of that contract, especially in the federal contract, because there's flow down clauses, and we're going to talk about that. Purchase agreement in the world usually means that it is custom order. That's where you cannot just return it. You can't just buy it off the shelf. Most of that is large products like HVAC systems or generators or big, large pieces of electrical equipment that are actually built custom to order, and then they're delivered to the site. Again, they are a purchase. There's no labor showing up on site. It's just strictly a buy. But again, it's now custom, which has a whole bunch of different liabilities and responsibilities because again, it's custom. So as if you were buying something for your home, if you buy it custom, you can't return it. I don't know how many of you got sucked into that at Lowe's where you order a custom window, but you can't just return that without a penalty. Purchase order type of product is caught, so you can take that window back because you took it right off the shelf. So that's the distinction between those two. And again, I just want you to kind of understand that because you may be in a situation where you have to then do a lower tier purchase order, and you need to be familiar with what those are, what the requirements are. Then there's a miscellaneous group, trucking, shipping agreements, rental agreements, disposals. Those are just standard type little services that are provided, but you still, again, because it's a federal contract, you have to have something in writing as to what the parties agree. You'll pick this up and dispose of it at the landfill. You want to make sure that you have a written agreement that they actually take it to a landfill so that when they take it, and I don't know how many of you remember a lot of the times where hazardous materials were being shipped, they just took them outside the base, dumped them over on the side of the road, and away they went. Well, again, you have to have a written agreement to make sure that says, if you pick this up, I'm hiring you to pick this up and take it to the landfill properly and give me a receipt showing me that you did dispose of it properly, so that the owner, in some cases the government, isn't held liable when they've taken hazardous waste and just poured it off on some country road. So again, all of these documents, as they start to expand, are written agreements, and each of them has different terms and each of them has different liabilities, and we're going to hopefully cover that. So anybody got any questions, don't hesitate to ask. Here's a little bit better definition of what I just covered. Long form, it's usually construction or subcontracts, what we refer to as long form. They come under a variety of names, but what you're looking for here, or what you might be reading if you've received one, is that it generally is construction. It's generally work on the site. It could also be some services, again, depending on how the company set it up, your prime contractor set them up. They could have grouped those together, but ideally they broke them out because there are different labor categories, different labor requirements, different reporting requirements. Usually they have much stricter terms and conditions. There's bonding requirements because Miller Act, which means that the owner who got something built on their site could be liable for that cost. And the government will always require a bond. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. But the government says, I don't want to ever be sued. So contractor, you have to carry a bond to make sure that whenever you install something, any of your suppliers that want to get paid for that, should you refuse to pay them, they have to go after your bond and not after me as the owner. They will pass that down. The prime contractor will pass that down to his subs that says, you will have suppliers, you will have laborers, and you have a potential to get sued once you provide those services. And I require you to carry a bond so that I can make sure that all your lower tier subs get paid. So bonding is often a big issue. Usually companies, construction firms especially, have trouble getting bonding capacity. And that often limits on how big a contracts you can get. But we can talk about that in detail or just in generality, since most of you are services. Bonding is required when you're doing public works, you're installing something. All of them will carry liability insurance and liability responsibilities. We want to touch on those today to make sure you understand what those responsibilities are. But again, the higher value and more risky the work is, the higher your liability requirements and insurance requirements are. They will carry warranty implications and requirements. They are both, these long forms generally are for higher risk for both the contractor and the subcontractor. Risk for performance, risk for damage, risk for unsuccessful, risk for not completing on time. So a long form is going to be a lot longer. That's exactly what it is. It's longer in narrative as it defines all of this. It often requires regulatory oversight. Department of Labor has a hand in it. OSHA safety has a hand in it. EPA has a hand in it. And all of these are passed down and included. And that's what I want to talk about mostly today is all these little hidden things that while you're off providing your service, you may not have paid attention to. And those can be very costly if you did any violations. Generally, and this is nothing I want to make sure you understand, is that your subcontract is going to discuss your payment terms. In the case of construction and for the federal government and for the prime contractor, most of those terms are paid when paid, meaning if I get paid as a prime contractor, then you get paid. And if I get paid for your acceptable work or the work that you do, it has to be inspected and accepted. If I get paid for it, you get paid for it. If I don't get paid for it because the government says that's unacceptable or something happens, then you don't get paid. So as a subcontractor, I want to make sure some of these little terms you're very much aware of. Paid when paid means you finance it for probably 60, 90 days, depending on how it's set up. And that's that might be a big money item for small businesses that they need to pay attention to. Now, before I go too much further, I want to tell you that all of the terms, of course, well, for the most part, I'm not going to talk about, I shouldn't say the mandatory flow down clauses, which we are going to cover, are negotiable. Those are not negotiable. You cannot change the terms and conditions of a federal contract. But you can negotiate the terms with your prime contractor, and one of those would be the paid when paid. And I see a lot of that. So I want to draw attention to it. I want you to be aware of it. I want you to make sure you read those in your subcontracts, and also that you pass those down should you be issuing subcontracts or lower tier subcontract purchase orders. Paid when paid means you finance the job until your work is accepted. And again, that could be 60, 90 days, and you need to be able to be financially responsible. Short form, on the other hand, is exactly what it means. The terms have been shortened. It's usually a lower risk. It's usually a smaller job. Generally, there's no bonds required because it's $3,500 to come and install a sink in a work area. The risk is then on the prime contractor, but the short form is intended to say to small businesses, this is easier. You don't have to get a bond. You don't have to carry all that liability. You don't have to provide certain things because if you screw up, we can absorb that risk. We get it covered. But again, there is insurance. There's usually warranty. It is minimal risk for the subcontractor and the contractor. So again, looking at, of course, by pure definition, how long is the subcontractor or whether it's short. And it will, as we walk through some of the samples I've given you, you'll be able to see which elements have been cut out and what you might be able to get cut out. So if you're ever negotiating a subcontract with the prime, again, some of these terms are negotiable and you want to know where to highlight them and to perhaps suggest they be cut out. Again, usually it's construction that you're providing a service. In some case, services fall into this. If you're providing something that has to be accepted or approved, you don't get paid until it's paid by the owner. It's not acceptable to the owner, you're not going to get paid for it. And again, you need to be aware of those for how long you have to finance your job. Services agreement. In our case, we call them, for my company, we call them services subcontracts, just because it's easier to define them. A lot of people see services agreement, and actually a lot of them have a preference. They think that the difference between agreement and subcontract is somehow different, and it is not. But services subcontract, services agreement. They're generally for professional services. They generally do not include providing anything to be built or included. They could be design services, which require a licensed engineer to stamp the drawings, or it could be survey services that's just come out and mark things off. It could be compaction testing. These are all services that are, and it could be work on site or off site. And again, you need to make sure that you're clear on your services subcontract, which one it is, because as you are working on a federal government site, you will have different insurance requirements and certain requirements to certify that your personnel meet conditions and terms and conditions. Again, it's work that is not incorporated into a project. It is just provided to assist, more or less. They are subject to Service Contract Act wages, which are different from Davis-Bacon. Generally, you will find that services are net 30. There is nothing, you aren't providing anything that the government has to expect and accept. With that being said, though, it could be a report or a submittal or some kind of testing. And you want to be very careful when you're looking at those terms as to whether or not they're net 30, meaning generally they're net 30. Again, that's negotiable. Prime contractors on federal jobs, it takes them about 30 days as a minimum to get paid, even though it's a 14-day construction fast pay. 30 days is for services if it's not construction. And you're not going to be paid generally any sooner than that because that requires the prime contractor to finance the payment. So you're probably not going to get any better terms than what the prime contractor is getting, but net 30 should be standard, meaning you get paid 30 days, within 30 days after you submit an invoice. Now, there is a little clause in the government that says that before the prime contractor can get paid again, he has to certify that all of his subs have been paid within 7 days after he received payment. Now, generally, they don't bill more than once a month. So generally, that isn't something that you will ever be faced, but that is a little term that they have to certify that you've been paid. The government got tired of subs complaining that they weren't getting paid on time. So you could get paid within 7 days after receiving the prime contractor receives payment. On services, it should be net 30. And you want to look for those terms to make sure that you are not on services paid when paid. Generally, a services contract will be set up as a not to exceed with unit or orders with unit prices. I want you to come out and just do a day's worth of compaction testing or so many tests or so many days coming out to stake out. On the other hand, it could also be a lump sum. On design, you're going to be paid a lump sum to provide all the design documents, no matter how long it takes. Not to exceeds are just what they mean. A daily rate, come out, you show up a day, you get paid for a day. On a design, it would be a lump sum. So again, you're looking at your payment terms, trying to figure out how you are going to get paid. And you want to make sure you negotiate that appropriately. Purchase orders. These are the types of documents. Again, we talked about COTS, commercial off the shelf. That is a federal term that is it's a public term, but it's also in the federal contract, very well defined. It's commercial off the shelf products. It's standard stock. It is unit priced, meaning, if anybody can go down and buy a widget or a length of pipe from Lowe's, then that's what the government is looking for. And that would be a COTS. We issue tons and tons of purchase orders. I'm sorry, I'm getting my terms already confused. We issue a lot of purchase orders for material for our construction site. It could be lumber, pipe, fittings, gaskets, lots and lots of building supplies. And we order those as COTS, commercial off the shelf. Those have the least amount of risk. I can call you up. You can not call you up, but I will issue you an order. I call you and say, now that you have that order, I want you to deliver 30 lengths of pipe. They are usually, they will be unit price. That includes all taxes, insurance, and those types of things that it takes for you to provide that. It's unit cost. The government does have a unique requirement that they require that they are receiving the best customer price, meaning you cannot gouge the government just because it's the government. If you sell that for your standard stock, for standard price to the public, that's the minimum the government will expect you to charge them. Oh, I'm sorry, the maximum you're allowed to charge them. Generally, again, it's net 30 days. You deliver something, you get paid for it. On materials, I'm sorry, on COTS, you will generally, 99% of the time, it's going to be net 30. So if you're a supplier, you can expect those kind of conditions and you can plan your company and budget accordingly. You do have to talk about, though, whether or not your price includes taxes or not. That is one thing that it sometimes can be confusing as to who pays the taxes. The government and the state is very particular about getting their taxes paid. And that is one of the terms that on your COTS order or your purchase order, you have to make sure you've covered. Does that include your tax or not include your tax? And who's going to collect that tax and who's going to pay that tax? So that is something that you need to be aware of if you are a vendor. Purchase agreements, now we're headed back the other way to more detail. These are pretty lengthy. They are custom ordered. They are custom built. They are usually very expensive pieces of equipment that are put together. They are high risk for liability. We replaced some power stations at one of the dams, and we had them built and then found out that they wouldn't fit. They didn't have the clearance to fit into the 1940 building that couldn't house that. So again, higher risk for both the prime contractor and the vendor providing the material. And so we have much stricter terms. Payment is usually now reverted back. We've gone the other way. It's usually paid when paid and accepted by the owner. There is lots more terms for non-compliant materials and warranties. And that's why we have two separate documents. One is just off the shelf, we can return it. The other one is, nope, it's custom made. And then we fall into the trucking, shipping, equipment rental agreements and disposal. Generally, in our case, and generally you will find, for example, if you're a trucking firm, that you have your own forms and your own, and you just rental agreements, and the whoever the client is, the prime contractor, subcontractor usually signs your forms. It's very difficult to get any rental agreement. If you can imagine going to Hertz and saying, here's a 90-page government contract, will you please sign this so I can rent your car? It is not going to happen. So they will say, go find somebody else to sign that document. So generally, we use the vendor forms. Generally, you pay it the minute you get the invoice. And that's kind of the category of how most of the forms are broken down. Now, as we went through and introduced ourselves, I made note that most of you are all service providers. So the services subcontract or services agreement is what you're going to be issued. And I sent, Kathy sent out some copies of some forms, and I think we're going to go through that one in some detail. I do want to flip back and forth because I do want to talk about some of the terms and conditions that you might be looking for. But I want you to be aware of these because if your services agreement with a prime contractor, and again, we're talking as a sub, so you're dealing with a prime contractor, you may have to issue a document, and I do specifically today want you to take away not only two things. I want you to take away the terms and conditions that you're looking for, especially
the rights. Is what's happening. I can leave and come back in.
Oh,
I don't think that'll work.
Sorry, I thought there was a question. I want you to take away what I'm hoping for you to accomplish as a subcontractor is take away where all the hidden terms are, where your risk is, and things you should be looking for instead of just signing documents blindly. I also want you to be aware of what you have to pass on as second tier or lower tier subcontractors that you are responsible for. And you may end up having one of these forms, like a purchase order, if you had to buy some material to provide in response to your work. So you may have lower tier subcontractors, and you have the responsibility to also pass down those requirements and to know which one of these documents is appropriate. Anybody got any questions so far? Okay, we're going to, again, hopefully today we're going to talk about all of these terms, and this is where a lot of people get overwhelmed. I see it today. I saw it when I was in the government. I see it as the contract manager for a large construction firm, is that the actual terms and conditions can be overwhelming. It seems a lot easier than it really is. But your subcontract agreement is going to have inclusions and exclusions. And you want to make sure, again, these are tips for you. You want to make sure that in your scope of work, now we're going to break this down into, 90% of your document is going, maybe not 90%, let's go with 60% of your document is going to be terms and conditions, standard business relationship operating requirements. There's going to be a good portion of your contract that is your scope of work. So let's break that into what is contractual, all of the other terms, and what is technical. What I call technical is your scope of work. And so in your scope of work, you want to make sure that your inclusions and exclusions are called out very clearly, and make sure that you're putting in exclusions. So I'm going to provide this, but it does not include this. It does not include the taxes. It does not include this permit. It does not include, hours, operating hours after 5 o'clock. Make sure that your terms and conditions in terms of technical are covered. So scope of work, inclusions, what did I include? Exclusions, what do I not include? And it's very important to make sure that you call out those exclusions because they are not assumed. If they aren't called out, they're assumed that you're providing them. And I, as the contracts manager, see that a lot where the small business says, well, I didn't intend to provide that, or I'm not providing that safety watch, or I'm not providing that report, or I'm not, I didn't include that. I just said I would do this work, not include that. And if it's not excluded, it is included. So just remember that. It's the opposite of, guilty until, innocent until proven guilty. In this way, it's included unless it is specifically excluded, okay? So your scope of work makes up what you are most interested in. I can guarantee you that that is the part where everybody wants to jump to and say, okay, what is it that you want me to provide and can I provide that? And you're interested in that because that, of course, is how you're going to prepare your bid. The part that nobody is interested in is the rest of the small print. And I want to cover the small print today because that's where you are going to be successful. And especially as a small business, you cannot be financially successful if you get caught in something that either you're not going to get paid and it bankrupts you, or you have to end up paying some kind of fine or penalty, or you don't get paid at all because you don't have the right certifications, or you didn't do e-verify, or you didn't do some of the hidden terms. That's what my goal is to find those hidden terms and talk to you about them. Your contract has got to include payment and invoice conditions. When am I going to get paid? How much am I going to get paid? And what are the terms of that? What does an invoice look like? What do they require as an invoice? What do I have to include? Those are also hidden terms. And again, I can give you some insight as a large contractor. If you don't give us a proper invoice, and we do tell you what a proper invoice is, it's too much work for us to figure it out. We are a multi-million-dollar contractor. We actually are owned by Quanta, which is Fortune 500, I think, at the moment. And we don't have time to handle and walk you through that. So your invoice is going to be rejected, and it might be another 30 days before it gets considered. So that's important to understand your invoice. What is an invoice? What do you expect? How do I have to prepare it? And when am I going to get paid? And how much am I going to get paid? That's yet another area you want to be very specific about. It's going to talk about your delivery and schedule. When we talked about what is a contract, the terms are part of when. When am I going to provide that service? If I don't have a when, it's going to be open-ended, and it really isn't a binding contract if it's just open. So look for those. When am I required to deliver this? What are the penalties if I don't deliver it on time? What's my schedule? Those types of things. We're going to talk about some of that a bit as we go through it. Rights and remedies. You have to remember that not everything goes perfect. So most of your contract, all of your subcontracts will address terms of what happens when things don't go right. How do I recover as a subcontractor? How might I be penalized as a subcontractor if I don't do something? So rights and remedies. Who can I recover from? How can I recover? And we're going to talk about some of those. Dispute resolution. What happens? How do we handle a dispute? Where does it go? Am I mandated to go to arbitration? And again, everybody assumes it's going to go good until it doesn't. These are terms that you have to protect yourself. There are procedures for breach. What happens if you breach the contract? And in the case for my company, if you breach the contract with me, you are going to cost me money because I probably won't finish my big job on time. And I might have $3,000, $4,000 daily liquidated damages. And so I'll make sure that my terms and conditions as my subcontracts make it very clear that if you breach, you fail to perform, you are going to suffer the consequences, financial penalties that I am going to suffer. Now that's, again, large business, but I want you to be aware of it so that you are looking for those things. What happens? Where are those hidden terms that if you breach or fail to provide it, what penalties are there? How do we terminate and cancel contracts or agreements? Subcontracts are agreements. That's got to be covered. Who has the right to terminate? When do you as the subcontractor have the right to not perform or to cancel? What are the terms of those? The federal contract is going to have flow down requirements. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today, but we're going to talk about it really in depth on next Tuesday about what those flow down requirements are, because they are truly hidden requirements. You'll see a title. They'll incorporate pages and pages of clauses by reference. And if you are not familiar with them, you are bound to them because you signed the subcontract. And I want to talk about those in some depth. They talk that your subcontract will have federal law and regulation requirements. It may have some social economic requirements. You may have to meet EEO requirements. You may have to meet some other kind of requirements, and you need to be aware of those. Unless you are providing just in COTS, meaning you're just providing a supply and never having to be responsible for showing up on site or employing people, you will have insurance. You will have insurance requirements. And as a minimum for service providers, you're going to have insurance for any employees you have, professional liability insurance, risk insurance. Those are things that are called out. We'll talk about that. Certifications. The federal government has very specific requirements. And again, when we get into the document, I'm going to show you where those are, that say by you signing this contract, you certify that. And generally those are like, you are not debarred. You are not owned by a third world country. You do not employ child labor. You do not, there are a lot of you do nots that you, by signing your subcontract, say, I certify that I am in compliance. I haven't broken any laws. And I want to show you where those are and what you want to be particularly looking out for. They're going to talk about how you handle claims, liens, and bonds. Again, now most of this is for construction. Services may not get into that at all. You may have some claims, and we will talk about that briefly. Damages, again, who damages who? Who's responsible for the services? Especially in services, professional services, you will carry damages and professional liability for the product and services you provide, because somebody else is relying on that. And if that fails, or your tests aren't correct, or your information isn't correct, those could suffer some serious liabilities, and therefore you have some damages that you may have to be responsible for. Could include warranties and workmanship. They're always going to talk about labor and employment laws and how you make changes. How do we make changes to our subcontract? Those terms have got to be called out. So I know I've thrown a lot at you. This is kind of general. I did provide you some copies. We're going to pull those up and walk through them in a little bit more detail. Okay. The one thing I want to kind of point out here now is that in federal contracts, and I'm going to say state for the most part, but I don't deal a lot with those and haven't seen very many. This happens to be the lead into our contract. Any prime contract, the requirements on flow downs is basically covered when the prime contract, first of all, the prime has to pass down certain things. We're going to talk about that. What is mandatory flow down? But what the prime contractors generally do, and we do it, is we say, you are incorporating, we've been awarded this contract, and we want to employ you to do a certain portion of that contract, whether it be services or building or trucking or anything like that. But we are going to incorporate the whole prime contract as part of our agreement. So if it's in the prime contract and it applies to you, you can assume that it's been incorporated by reference. Prime contractors do not want the legal responsibility of hand picking out what applies to you and what doesn't. So generally, and this is what I want to draw your attention to, is that it may in somewhere in your contract say, we're incorporating the prime contract by reference. And what by reference means, of course, is that I'm not attaching it. Now, I can guarantee you that most of the companies that are large enough to know better, and you should, if you're a prime contractor, know better, you should incorporate the prime contract. There are so many terms and so many things. Even the Division I, if you're trying to get on base, you know, what is proper ID? What is, you know, drug-free? I mean, there's just so many requirements that are not necessarily related to your work that are attached. So most prime contractors will say, I've been awarded a contract and that contract applies to you. I'm going to incorporate it by reference. Here's my takeaways for you. Always ask for a copy. Don't ever just assume that you know what that prime contract, don't ever sign anything that you don't have actual copies of those in your hands. I have seen recently where some of our vendors have come in for supplies and said, oh, by the way, if you go to our homepage, our terms and conditions are listed on our homepage and those apply. I'm not even going to call them out here. You just go to our homepage and you figure out, it says right there, terms and conditions. Well, the problem with that is how often can those terms and conditions change? And what am I agreeing to? So I always, if I'm in that situation, I always print them off and I always keep them in the file because those are the terms that we agreed to at that time. But I would say to you, don't ever sign anything that you don't have a hard copy, electronic copy, some kind of physical copy of what it is you are saying you've agreed to. I've seen so many, I'm not telling you to read it because, I am encouraging you to read it, but in the time frame and what's going on, it could be a 700-page document and you don't have time to go through all of those terms and conditions. I get that. I'm going to try to give you some cheat sheets or thoughts on how to make sure that you're covered, but you are going to be, it's going to be incorporated by reference, and you don't ever want to sign anything that you have not been provided a copy of, okay? So don't sign it unless you have a copy of it. Be ready to incorporate it. That's one of the bad things. Now, right down here is the clause that you're worried about. Subcontractor is bound to the contractor to the same extent the contractor is bound to the owner. Okay, where in the contract reference is made to the contractor and the work or specifications pertain to your trade, craft, or type of work or such, it is interpreted that you are us, you are me, you are I. You are the prime contractor, so you want to be aware of it. This is buried in most of your federal contracts, and you want to look for it. You want to make sure you understand it. This is where you can also push back, and this is, I don't use it on me if I ever employ you, but you need to push back a little bit and say where it is specifically referenced or where it is referenced to me on this trade. You want to clarify to what extent you are actually required to comply. So if you get any editing opportunities, this is where you want to seriously look at this statement, because they are saying you're bound to me the same way, me being the prime, you're bound to me the same way that I am bound to the owner. We're joined at the hip and you are responsible. And I'm not going to tell you where all that is because it's just too detailed and too cumbersome for me to break it all down for you. So I'm just going to give you the copy of the 800-page contract and say, hopefully you've read this because you're bound to it the way I am bound to it. And this is probably one of the biggest takeaways I would like for you to think about today. In federal contracts, most of this is on every single subcontract, okay? Up here, see, we even bury is you certify that you are fully certified. By you signing the contract, you are certifying, meaning you're acknowledging that you are fully familiar with the terms and conditions of the contract. So we're going to catch you several ways. And I say we, I sound like I'm the villain here, but this is a prime contractor talking to subcontractors. You're familiar with it and you're certifying that you're familiar with it. So therefore, you can't stand up in court later and say, I had no idea that was in there. Okay? I had no idea I had to get a permit from EPA in order to take that test sample out of the water. Okay. And these are the things that you want to appears where it says that contract, this contract I just told you about, including all amendments, which sometimes is even harder to get, and subcontract modifications can be accessed, and you ask them, either give it to me hard copy or tell me where it's in a box or something, a box location that I can download it, and make sure you download it, okay? Because if you're relying on something that is just out there in the cloud and they have control over it, it could disappear. So make sure you're doing that. So that's my number one takeaway for you, okay? Questions, thoughts, comments? Somewhere in your subcontract, it is going to talk about what is included in that subcontract. There's two things that I want to draw attention to here. Is that somewhere, ours is in our long form, this happens to be in section 21, to the extent the document attached here to or incorporated by reference makes up the entire contract. Again, these are some legal terms that lawyers write, but attached here to or incorporated by reference. We again are telling you that it is all included and it is part of this agreement, okay? Now we will say, you want to make sure that if there's a contract, but if there's a conflict between the provisions of this subcontract and the terms of the prime contract, the subcontract will prevail. You want to make sure at least this term is in here, that if the prime contractor called out something and told you something specific and it is in conflict with the prime contract, you want the subcontract to prevail. You want to be able to say, we discussed this basically in writing and my subcontract will prevail. Here's the key I want you to take away. Unless those references are included or included, meaning your proposal, your quote or proposal, whatever you've given them with your terms and conditions on them. Sometimes you'll give them a quote that says, here's my unit price. Here's what I think. By the way, I want payment in 20 days. And I'm not going to be available on Fridays, or just hypothetically thinking here. Unless your quote or proposal is incorporated by reference, it is not, okay? And a lot of contractors, subcontractors come back and say, well, wait a minute, I told you that condition when I gave you my quote. And we say as the prime contractor, yes, but this is what we finally agreed upon. Okay, this is the subcontract, and our subcontract did not include any reference to your quote. This is probably the second biggest takeaway I'd like you to think about and mark down, is that if you have terms and conditions or things that are called out on your quote and they did not get incorporated into the subcontract, either in the technical scope, the scope of work, or as part of the provisions, exclusions, your quote means nothing. It's not worth the paper that it was printed on, okay? So that's another big takeaway right there. I want you to always think about and include when you're negotiating a subcontract. You want yours referenced. When I get that request, and I'm often amazed that it's less than you actually would think, as the contracts manager, I will ask you for your terms and conditions, and I actually will sit with you, or we do it in writing on a checklist we have, and we'll go through and make sure there's no conflict between the two documents. So if you say net 20, I say my subcontract net 30, you and I are going to agree. If we agree on net 20, I'm going to actually edit my subcontract to include that, so there is not a conflict. And you want to insist that they do that. You want to at least have a responsible party that says, if there's a conflict, we've resolved it. I've either by quote, because even if I included your quote, I've stated right here that subcontract has precedence. So if you said on your quote, net 20, I want paid in 20 days, and my terms of the subcontract say net 30, you're not going to get paid for 30 days. I told you right here, buried in here, is the subcontract has precedence. So you have not accomplished anything. So while you want it incorporated, if you want it incorporated, you also have to make sure that there's no conflict. And if there is a conflict, you want them, ask them to edit it, and they will do that, okay? So we got about 45 minutes left. This is now for you. What I'm going to do, if I can make this happen appropriately, is I'm going to call up, Kathy sent you 3 documents. Since most of you are services, I'm going to pull up the services. It's not as detailed as the long form, but you, from all of you, it looks like you do services. So this would be if you were subcontracting to me as Nova Group Inc. for some services, this is the document I would send you. And I would say, I need you to sign this document. So we're going to walk through this document and show you where some of the hidden features are that you want to be advised and aware of, and possibly suggest edits. Okay? Everybody still with me? Can you see this services subcontract agreement?
Yes.
Anybody?
Yes.
Somebody? Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. And Kathy sent you 3. I think Kathy sent you the PDFs for 3. I sent you the subcontract, or the long form. I sent you a purchase order, and I sent you, you should have this services agreement. So those cover the 3 types of, those are generally the 3 types of documents we would send out. This would be one that I'm giving you as a sample. Some of this is very, we have ours set up, and most prime contractors, large prime contractors, don't manually type these. These are printed. We have basically a computer program. We store all this data, we pull all this data, and it self-populates. So that's what a lot of these little brackets are. And you'll see it again, basic information, who the contractor is, our address, who's our responsible party, and who your responsible party, who's agreeing to this, who's signing this. So this is just some basic administrative requirements. They tell me there's some legal ramifications as to why this is listed here in this manner, and I just want to walk through this. In this case, on our services, we have 4 separate attachments, and we call them exhibits. The first one is an exhibit for small business. It's called Exhibit SB, and it is going to say that you are required before entering into this contract that you state your small business certifications. And this is what Kathy mentioned earlier. If you will not list your MBEs in here, and we'll scroll down to that page here in a minute, it will say, matter of fact, you'll bear with me and not get dizzy. Let's just jump right down to that. Here is the attachment, and you're going to fill it out. One of the things I want to draw attention to is DUNS is now in the process of going away, but again, if applicable, there's a SAM entity ID, if applicable, because it's going to that. You do not have to be registered in SAM to get a subcontract. You do have to be registered in SAM to receive a contract, being a prime contract. You do not have to be registered in SAM to have a subcontract. But if you are, we'd like you to provide that information, because if you're registered in SAM, you have your certifications, your business status certifications are in SAM. If you registered in SAM, the government says that's good enough. We'll accept whatever they certified in SAM. So that's why we ask for this information. Cage code, again, if you're registered in SAM. Now we will tell you NAICS, North America Industry Code Standard, if I'm guessing again, Terry can correct me if I'm wrong. It sets up a code for each category of work, services, category work, supplies, vendor, and you will be assigned that. Now you don't get to assign that, we get to assign it, because I, as the prime contractor, am responsible for saying this is the work you are doing. You may be certified, or you may have NAICS codes for other types of products and services. And again, NAICS codes are free, they're in SAM, you can be covered by as many as you want. But for reporting purposes, I am required as the prime to tell you what your NAICS code is. I am hiring you to do this type of product and services. There is a size standard. Usually for services, it's going to be number of employees. And I will tell you what that is. So these are self-populated. This is the work you're doing. This is the size standard that you have to meet. If you are not registered in SAM and you have not done that process, this will be the certification that you'll fill out. You'll be stating here whether you're a large business or a small business. If you're a small business, do any of these other categories, do you meet any of these other certifications? And if you aren't familiar with these, call Kathy, set up an appointment, see if you meet the requirements for any of these. And these mostly, these services or categories or classifications over here, most of them have to be certified in another manner. Some of them are self-certification, some of them have to be approved by the VA, or you have to receive a certificate for HubZone. But again, you're saying now this is strictly data record keeping, but I'm required as a prime to report it. That's why you're filling this out, and that's why you're certifying it before you can even get a contract with me. If you're a large business, because I also have some other reporting requirements that have nothing to do with the government, we're collecting data here on whether you are a MBE, WBE. These are more generic codes. They mean nothing. We're just asking you to collect data. I mean, I'm sorry, it doesn't mean that they don't mean anything. They're not required for federal contracts. This is now strictly for my company and for our reporting to a different program. Here's what I want to draw attention to, and that's why we often say, are you registered in SAM, or you've told the government one thing? Because you represent and certify that this information is true, and that you may be under penalty if you lie about it. Okay, you may receive punishment of a fine. I don't know if anybody's ever gone to prison for saying they're a small business, but you know, they like to be heavy on the threats. So you have to certify when you sign this that you are in fact a small business, that you meet that criteria, and that you're not falsifying your records. I'm relying on this information as a prime contractor because I'm reporting it. Okay. Here again is all your business definitions and descriptions if you should need them, and down here you will sign it. Okay. Anybody got any questions about that process? If you don't fill that out, I can't issue you a subcontract. It's kind of like, this is administrative. This is what supports the small business. This is what ensures the government enforces upon primes to make sure that they're meeting their requirements and not just cheating the system by giving it to their big businesses that they prefer. We are in fact going to small businesses. The next thing that's included is what we call it Exhibit SC. It is what your subcontract agreement includes federal, here's that FAR, relating to, and here, the reason it is it's called SC here is because it's certification. And I'm going to hop down to that one. Bear with me for the scrolling. This will say, each of these will say is that you are signing this subcontract, you represent and warrant. These are those certifications I was talking about, and these are mandatory. You will not have an opportunity to edit these. But having experience on both sides now, I have actually called them out. You may get a subcontract that they have not taken this effort to do this, or it's buried in the text someplace. I put all the certifications on one page. You may find these buried somewhere else in your subcontract if it's another firm that's doing that. But these are all the certifications that the government requires that by you signing your subcontract and that they be flowed down are actually enforced. I don't put them in here unless they're required. And again, you might find these buried somewhere else, but these are the things that you should be looking for, okay? Immigration, you know, that you are in compliance with this Reform and Control Act, okay? And again, here's what you're certifying. You have to certify that you are compliant with E-Verify, that any employees that you have, you do register them through the E-Verify program. And you will have to make sure that if you're not doing that now, you have employees, you will want to make sure you get the PTAC, and we'll get you set up to make sure that you understand the E-Verify requirements, that you're certifying that you are enrolled and that you are processing this for all of your people. You also certifying that you have a contractor code of business ethics and conduct. Again, there's some clauses here. These are again buried. It's saying that by the contractor code and ethics program is that you will not whistleblower. There's a whole bunch of information that's in here, but you have to comply with good business ethics and conduct. And the government asks you to certify that. Again, there is some requirements here for large dollar amounts that you have a written program, but you are saying that I do have some kind of ethics program, meaning that I am required to report waste, fraud, and abuse. I am not allowed to if I see any evidence of taxpayers' dollars being used illegally, immorally, I am required to report that. And how do I manage my business ethics and conduct? This is one of those things that if you're not aware of them, and when I talk to small businesses, I'm like, you do know you have to have at least a written page of what your business ethics and conduct is. And they're not, because again, these are buried terms that you may or may not ever know about. So again, I'm calling attention to them. Here you're certifying that you are not debarred. You cannot be debarred from federal contract, any federal agency. Not within 3 years have you been debarred, and you're saying that I am in good standing with the government, federal government. I have not been debarred, and I am eligible for a contract. Again, you are certifying that you agree to that. Again, these are all usually buried someplace else. Maybe the prime contractor may not have even included them, but any prime contractor with their salt is required to get these certifications in all of their documents. If you issue any subcontracts further, lower tier, are required to get these and certified and put in there. And I will show you where those are in the clauses. Reporting executive compensation. Most of you do not meet this requirement. And again, this is included because I have to flow it down. Here's the conditions that you have to meet in order to report your executive compensation. You have to have 80% of your annual gross revenues come from federal contracts. This does not apply to a lot of people. It applies to my company because we in fact do 99% of the federal government is 99% our client. I mean, we don't have any private sector work except for minor cases. So we would have to report on this. And it's 25 million more in gross revenues. So for most of you, this is passed down. Most of you, this will never apply. But you're saying, yep, if I made this much money, first of all, I wouldn't be small business. Second of all, you're not my only client, government, so I don't have to report this. But if in fact you did, it's saying that I promise to report my top 5 executives. Yeah, 5 highly most compensated executives and how much you pay them. It is Freedom of Information Act. So again, this should not apply to you, but it's being passed down and you're certifying. Again, some other certifications, Disputes Act, okay? There's certain requirements that you have to, if you're in a dispute, you have to claim that, yes, I will process this. Here is the contract disputes proposal representation. I will have my truth in negotiations, claims. Again, you can read all of this, but I'm certifying that in fact, I am aware of this False Claims Act. Again, will it apply to you? Probably not. Are you required to certify? Yes, you are. And generally this is buried somewhere. Certifications to disclosure. This is of course this big one. They want to say, yep, I have not paid anybody to influence federal transactions. I haven't paid to get this subcontract. I haven't bribed my congressman. I'm a very upstanding citizen, but again, you have to certify that. Now we're looking here. We also have clean air and water. By signing this agreement, you certify that I will make sure I am not in violation of any Clear Air or Water Act, that my whatever process I do, whatever services I provide, I have not violated any of these. Now, as a prime contractor and buried in the clauses, these are things you have to certify. Again, with my experience, I've put them on one page so that you can read them. You are not allowed to edit these. You, by signing a contract, have to comply with them, okay? But again, knowledge is power. You should know that you're signing that somewhere. Here's Exhibit SI. These are your insurances. And we can talk about that in a little bit. I'd like to get to that a little bit later, but here's the insurance requirements. Again, they may be buried in some kind of text of a subcontract. I break them out on a separate attachment so that you can see what your insurance requirements are depending on what type of product you're delivering to me. This exhibit fed, this is something not a lot of people do for you. And I prefer this, again, because of my experience as a contracting officer, because of my work at the PTAC. I call these out now. We're going to spend a lot of time on next Tuesday, talking about this. And I'm going to jump to that attachment. You should have these copies. Here's a list of all of the federal law and regulation compliance, okay? And of course, it's saying that by you agreeing to sign this, that you will comply with all of these. And here's the point. We talk about EEO, we talk about affirmative action for veterans and the disabled. Here's where we're going to tell you whether this is Buy American Act or not. If this is a services, I still have to tell you that if it's Buy American Act, if you're providing anything, you do have to comply with the Buy American Act. And again, as services, this may or may not apply to you, which is always good to understand. If you, the government says that this is a rated order, meaning it's higher on the priority chain of services to be provided. Military, national defense comes first. And so what this clause says is that if there's a conflict, and we're using this a lot now, I can tell you right now with the supply chain disruptions, we pull this out a lot saying, no, the government this is a rated order. And so it gets to go to the front of the line. Now on services, I would struggle a little bit to figure out how this would relate to you, but you just need to be aware of it. It is rated. So if you had 10 clients in line and I came and asked you for something and you agreed to it, and you said, well, wait a minute, now I've got COVID, has affected 3 of my employees, I'm out, it's going to be a 6-month delay in service. I have the right, the government has the right to say, nope, I get to move to the front of the line. So just be aware of that. Services, not so much. Construction, this is really an important vendor supply chain. This is really a big deal for us right now. And we pull this out all the time and say, you agreed to it, you've got to move us ahead of the other people in the line. So again, that's buried. You may not know that. But here's the part that I want to get to, and we're going to talk about on Tuesday. Here are all mandatory flow-down clauses. Now I can give you, if you come to work for NOVA, you will get a copy, probably 120 pages of all the full text. Whether you ever wanted them or not, I will provide them to you. They will include clauses that may not be mandatory flow down, but offer you some advice and some guidance, and I will show you those too. Here's the mandatory ones. And as you can see, there is, 2 pages of mandatory clause, 3 pages of mandatory clauses. And they are incorporated by reference in my prime contract. I've incorporated them by reference in your contract, but I have told you when they apply. See, this is applicable to all subcontracts and purchase orders. And I have told you that if your subcontractor exceeds 2,000, here's all the Davis-Bacon requirements. And so you could kind of go through here and figure out which ones apply and which ones don't. This is not something all prime contractors will do for you. It's something that they should do for you, but this takes a lot of work to make sure you stay state of the art, know which requirements apply and when they apply. But as you can see, there's 3 pages of clauses. These are terms that you're saying by signing the subcontract that you have acknowledged, and that 1, you've acknowledged them and you can comply with them, and 2, that you will pass these down to any other lower tier subcontractors. And that I can guarantee, if I hadn't provided this to you, if a prime contractor isn't provided to you, I can guarantee you're not taking the time to go pull those clauses and pass it down to someone else. You're just saying to your lower tier subs, oh, by the way, it's incorporated by reference, go figure these out. Now, most of them are kind of incidental. Most of them are just kind of generic things that make sure you're covered. But there could be some, little tweaks in here that could end up getting you in trouble if you didn't. Here's the employment verification. Here's texting, there's affirmative action, there's notification of employee rights. There's lots of little buried things. And on next Tuesday, we're going to go through these. And again, forgive me for scrolling. What I've told you is, in addition to including the prime contract, I have given you an exhibit that says that these provisions, these bar clauses apply, and that by signing this, you've acknowledged that. Again, you will not see this necessarily called out this way. This is the way we set ours up. Generally, these terms are buried in your text somewhere, and you need to be looking for them. Okay, anybody got any questions so far? Then they're going to talk about somewhere you're going to be led into what is the entire contract. And this is where, if you want yours incorporated, this is the entire contract. This is this agreement, whether it's referred to as a subcontract agreement, is made in the state. It includes the prime contract. You certify you're familiar with it, and that you're bound to the same terms. This is just the standard lead off that says, yep, here it is, but this is what consists of it. If you want your quote or proposal incorporated, you need to get it referenced in here. Okay, you need to say, right here, say, edit in here is that my quote on such and such a day is also incorporated by reference. If there's a conflict, you need to say, I either want to resolve them or my quote has precedence because that's what I bid. But this is where you would be looking to include that information. Again, we talked about, maybe 20, 40% of what you're interested in. Well, 90% of what you're interested in is right here in the scope. Somewhere they're going to tell you either by attachment, what it is you're going to provide. Here, this is important. Make sure you get any exclusions in there that you want excluded, because if it's not excluded, it's assumed that it is included. Because up here we say perform all the work, provide all the labor, material, and other things necessary. If you don't exclude it, it's covered. Okay. You might find some information as to what submittals are required. Again, if you're providing a service for us, we're construction, we have these submittals. You might even be doing design or environmental or something along those lines. We're going to tell you what your submittal requirements are and what date timeframes you've got allowed for the government. So again, technical scope of work. This is what you're interested in. This is what you're bidding, but it takes a very small portion. If you'll notice that I have like 1 page reserved for the scope of work and 3 pages at the very end reserved for clauses that are flowed down. So, okay. You're going to find somewhere it's got to talk about your price. Remember, that has to be consideration received for any services. Again, what do we agree to pay you? How much? What the unit prices? There's some notes, maybe what does the not to exceed mean? What does, what do my terms mean? Or what am I getting paid? You want to make sure that that's called out. Here, you're going to find something on payment. You need to know about what my invoices have to look like. Okay. When do they have to be received? In this case, we need to close out. We want to receive it by the 25th of each month. Each of these should be unique. Each of these will be customized to the vendor that you're working for, or the prime contractor that you're working for. Okay. We reserve the right to return any invoices that aren't proper. This is going to delay your payment. So you want to make sure you're in full compliance with what the invoices are supposed to say. This is very critical for you to find and for you to understand. Payments will be made to some contractor when. Now, if you called up some of my other samples I gave you, it would say paid when paid. This is very important that you're looking for this. When am I going to get paid? 30 days after I receive a proper invoice, et cetera, et cetera. If you want that to be less, if you're offering terms, if you're saying, 5%, 20, those need to be called out here. And this is what you want to edit if at all possible. Work it out. There's a requirement for you to list vendors that you have lower tiers over 5,000. That's a prime contract requirement that's usually buried somewhere or buried in the text or in the prime contract. This is another area that we have reserved the right to offset payments. If you have any liens, or we've noticed that you haven't paid your subcontracts, or you've got any kind of non-payment notice or labor dispute, and this is just a term that says we reserve the right to not pay you, to offset that, because we are responsible to the owner to pay it. So again, those things you want to know. You're always going to find a section, or you should find a section, and again, highlight these because you want them. How do you change the work? How do we agree to change the work? How do we agree to change this subcontract? You have to know what your rights and remedies are as to what your agreement is. Can you force me to work? Can you not force me to work? Are we going to do any changes? How many days do I have to get you my proposal? Those types of things. Schedule of work is very important. You want to pay attention to this, because if you screw up the schedule, then you screw up the prime contractor schedule. Prime contractor, if they're working through the federal government, usually has liquidated damages. The government says this is the due date, you got to make it. We have to make sure you meet that requirement. So there'll be something on schedule. Then you'll see a whole section on what your obligations are, what your responsibilities are. Again, we're saying to provide all, everything you need to do to provide the performance of work. If it's not excluded, it's included. You have to remember that. And you also can't come back to me and say, well, I didn't include taxes or I didn't include this. No, if it's not excluded, it is included, okay? Again, you're gonna see, in our case, and in a lot of prime contracts or subcontracts I've read, is again, the obligations for the prime contract, okay? And the rights and remedies of the owner under the contract are applicable to the work that may be enforced. If the government reserves the right to issue some action against your work, then again, you're bound to that same way. If you do not get a copy of that, that's your first mistake, is that you are not aware of what those are. Will always be some kind of indemnification. Now, most of the small businesses don't employ a lawyer. It may be something you want a lawyer to look at or to get some guidance on, is what is indemnification? How do we make sure that if you do, again, to the full extent permitted by law, you will indemnify and hold the contractor harmless. You indemnify us that if you have any labor, material shortages, liability losses, damages, that you hold us, you hold us harmless. Okay, if there's an accident, if somebody gets hurt, your employee shows up to take a test, he gets his foot cut, we've been indemnified. And this is really hard for small businesses to really grasp what is indemnification and what are the rights and remedies, because a lot of you don't have lawyers that have looked into this. This may be something that you want to spend a little bit of time on, because these are the types of things that the lawyers add that you may or may not be aware of, and how do I protect myself as to who I can sue and who I can't sue and who do I hold harmless, okay? So highlight this, pay attention to that, seek some advice and some guidance. Make sure you understand what this is. Indemnification is one of the biggest things in a contract that often go overlooked, okay? In the case of the federal government, you have to be drug-free. And here's all the requirements that you and your employees, including those that don't show up on site, have to be drug-free. You have to have some kind of drug-free program or controlled substance screening. And so this is what it is. And if you by any chance don't have one, we reserve the right to enforce one, because we are required under the prime contract to be drug-free. Release of information is very generic. You can't release it. Time is of the essence. I am not a lawyer, but I understand that this is a key term right here. Time is of the essence. And if you're required to provide it, again, on services, I would make sure that in your scope of work says, how much time do I get notified before I have to respond? How much time is required and when's it going to? So make sure that your scope of work is defined. You know what your performance criteria is. If you just say, okay, I'll provide testing services, and you never say, by the way, you got to give me 48 hours notice, and they call up and say, be here in an hour, that's going to be a conflict if you haven't clarified that. So again, time is of the essence. The prime contractor will screw up just as much as the sub, so make sure that your performance criteria, when do I have to respond? How much notice do I have to give? And if I have to respond any sooner, that might be a higher cost. I might have to pay overtime. I might have to shuffle somebody. This is something you want to pay attention to. You're going to be required to have all of your permits, licenses, inspections required in connection with the work. I get a lot of feedback from contractors like, well, I'm not going to get the permit for the job for environmental. Well, no, this is saying that in order for you to do your work, you have to carry the proper, in order to be a contractor, to do the services you provide, you have to, of course, be licensed. If you're going to stamp a drawing, you have to be a licensed engineer. If you're going to provide testing, you may have to have a certification that you're authorized to do that. But you also have to be aware that if you're coming out to test water, the contamination levels in the water, that you have a permit to do that. And if it's required to have a permit for that job, then you need to make sure our communication is either I get the permit as the private contractor, or you have to get the permit in order to do your work. This is something you want to pay attention to if you're providing those types of services, okay? Safety, if you do not come on our site, this is not a big issue, but if you come on our site for any reason to do any of your services, you have to be aware that there is this accident prevention clause, and that you have to be aware of our plan, and you have to be aware that you are not entitled to an equitable adjustment if you do not perform safely. Okay, so safety on a federal job site is very important. Again, if you're providing a service from your office, this may or may not apply. You will be required to state that I am an independent contractor and that I carry my business license and that I pay my employees and my unemployment and that I am no way an employee of the prime contractor. So again, independent contractor, somewhere in your subcontract you get for anybody, it will require that you certify that in fact, I am not working for or as employee and I do pay my taxes and I am licensed and registered. Somewhere in your subcontract, there will be a dispute resolution. So again, highlight these things and be looking for them in any subcontractor. How do we settle the dispute? Are you required to go to arbitration? Can I just sue you by going straight to court if we have an issue? Again, everything is good until it's not good. So you want to make sure that you are prepared or you at least understand what the prime contractor is telling you, okay? A lot of contractors will say you're forced to arbitration before you can actually sue me in court. And so this is where you're going to find that. Again, make sure you highlight that, make sure that you have it covered in any of the other subcontracts that you might see or look at, because you want to know what happens if I do want to sue you? What happens if you do not pay me? How do I get that resolved? And this is where you, somewhere in your subcontract, you have to have, how do we handle a dispute, okay? Again, this is more small business information. In this case, this NAICS code has this many employees. And again, I'm providing you that information as the prime. The prime should be providing you that. Tell me what service it is you want me to provide and look that up. If you don't have that, if they don't fill that out and you are confused by where to find that information, of course, always call the PTAC and we can point you to this, to the SBA website that tells you what those codes are and what the size standard is, okay? Again, a little bit more on size standards and generally, again, under disputes, if we have any issues, you know, are we going to get to recover attorney's fees and what state are we going to handle this in? So this being a services contract, this is the minimum you should be looking for. This is the minimum that should be provided to you. Again, there's a block that says, you know, what's your state license number? Are you incorporated? This is just some basic record keeping. So then we get into the attachments. Now, if you ever get into, I provided you 2 extra copies, the long form, which has probably, instead of 19 pages, is probably 40 pages because it has a lot more terms, a lot more risk, a lot more cancellation notices. You'll notice that nothing in here said, when can we cancel it? Who's authorized to cancel it? This is pretty much an at-will type of contract. If I thought that this was a $200,000 design, I might include some provisions for who can cancel, who can terminate, and what happens when we terminate. This is rather straightforward. This is, again, what I said is the minimum. But if you went to the long form that I provided you a copy of, I'll just call it up real quick, and it is, oh, it's only 25 pages. And let me scroll through here. Payment, overpayment, changes in work, schedule work, a lot of it. This is a notice to cure. This section, of course, is not in the services, but this is saying if you do not diligently prosecute the work, I can cure you, I can terminate you, and then here's what it's going to cost you or what might happen if you don't get it done. So again, you might see these terms in your subcontract. Again, depending on the value of your subcontract, you might request that be struck out. Is that I don't, what do I, bankruptcy, insolvency, some of these again, these are much larger, higher risk jobs and terms. We want to make sure that you don't go bankrupt. We want to make sure that you aren't delayed. We want to make sure that we can terminate you for convenience. If the owner terminates us, we want to be able to terminate you. We also have sections for damages caused by the owner. I need to sue the owner because I have a different site condition, or he didn't allow me access, or he didn't do something. So this long form has more, and that's why I provided you all 3 copies. Here's a much larger section on indemnification. Again, higher risk job, higher value. This are terms that you may see, may not see, okay? There's just more information in here, more requirements. Again, they're based on the level of risk, but I gave you several copies so that you can compare them back and forth. Purchase orders, I don't see any vendors here, are even shorter than that because again, it's off the shelf material. Here we talked about the business certification process you have to sign. Here's the certifications that are, again, mandatory, flow down the government says you can't do work with me if you haven't complied with these. If you do not are not signed up and use E-Verify, you cannot, you're not supposed to be doing federal work, okay? And then again, the last attachment, oh, here's the insurance. Okay, and again, this confuses, this is the reason we made this a standard attachment is our insurance requirements are the same across the board. And a lot of service providers, a lot of vendors come back, vendors, we won't carry this on if they don't come on site. But a lot of service contractors come back and say, well, I don't have any, for example, excuse my scrolling, I don't have all risk builders insurance. I don't build anything. So this does not apply to me. Well, again, we would say, okay, yeah, that's evident by the scope of work, but you may want to exclude that. You might want to say, I don't have all risk insurance, okay? And you want to make sure that you're aware of that. Our company requires general liability of $10 million. That's usually really high for small businesses. Again, it's a company-driven requirement. Again, you would negotiate this. You would say, I don't carry that much coverage. I carry 5 million or 2 million. And we would take a look at, you would propose it, but this is where you want to make sure you're offering, you know, an edit. I can't carry 10 million. If you sign this without making those adjustments and you send me even a certificate of insurance and it says 2 million, but something happens on the site, I'm going to say contractually you are required to carry this. Whether you gave me evidence of it or not is irrelevant. You are required to carry this. So again, you want your terms and conditions to be edited. You want them to say, oh, we agree to this and that I am not held to something should something go wrong. So you are required to carry casualty insurance, workman's comp if you have employees. You have general liability insurance that generally all contractors carry. Again, we ask for a high level. You may not have that high level, and as a small business, you may want to suggest an edit, and we would consider it. Automobile insurance, if you show up on the site, otherwise we don't need evidence of your insurance, auto insurance, if you don't show up on site. If you are doing any kind of hazardous material or professional liability, this is where you would have to carry liability insurance. So it's professional services, including design build services. If you're on a services contract, you would be required to carry professional liability unless you exclude it. So again, these are those types of things that you want to get carried in the scope of work of saying, I don't want to carry professional liability. I don't sign anything. I'm not responsible for anything. And we may say, well, you come out and you're a surveyor. You know, if you screw up your stakes and put them in the wrong spot and I build the building in the wrong spot, I'm not waiving your professional liability. You are liable. Providing EPA type reports or any kind of design services, we would say, no, you have to carry professional liability. On the other hand, if you're bringing out water and supplying water for the site, do you need professional liability, or can we believe that you can actually get the water in the tank without damage? So I say that now, and then something will happen. You have to have a continuance of coverage for the entire contract. You have to provide evidence of that by a certificate. And one of the unique things that the government requires is that you actually have to list the contract on each insurance document, copy of certified copy or evidence of insurance. We call them COIs, certificate of insurance. And you actually have to list the contract title on it. We send this back a lot saying, you just got to call your insurance company. You got to include the contract number because the government requires it. The government says, the government on this project will be listed as an insured on the policy. And we get a lot of pushback from that, but it's a mandatory requirement. So make sure you review this insurance and make sure that whatever insurance evidence or they've asked for, that you've read it, you understand it, and that you've excluded any of it, or that your scope of work says, I will not be providing hazardous or professional liability services. I am not a builder, so I am not going to provide all risk builders insurance, okay? And make sure that when you're looking at any subcontract, you know what the insurance requirements are, okay? A lot of companies we say that you have to comply with the contract. The contract has insurance requirements in the prime contract. Generally, prime contractors want higher than what the government calls out for, but if they have not addressed it, please be advised that your prime contract does require insurance. And again, if they haven't called it out, you just need to be aware that it's there and ask for a copy of it. Insurance is required. Tuesday, we're going to talk about all of the hidden clauses now that apply to just doing work as a federal contractor. And it won't be in too much detail, but I want to point out your pitfalls, things that you want to watch for. You will not be authorized to deviate. You will not be able to say, I'm going to strike this. Matter of fact, I just had a services contractor, excuse my scrolling again, came back and say, I'm services. None of this Davis-Bacon stuff applies to me. And they tried to strike them. And I said, I get that, but I'm required to flow these down. And these clauses say, if you're doing work, you have to pay these wages. Well, you're not doing that work. So I had them go back and put it in the scope of work, that this is services work and it is not subject to Davis-Bacon, so that we had an agreement. But I am required as prime contractor to flow these down. So sometimes you ask for something that the government or the prime contractor can't do for you if they've got the wherewithal to know that, but you can edit it out in the scope of work. So I know that was kind of quick. We're going to talk about all of these federal clauses later. Can everybody still see my screen?
Yes.
Oh, good, because the little mark went away, so I wanted to make sure I wasn't just talking to anybody. I mean, to myself. It looks like we should be wrapping this up. Kathy sent you 3 copies. The standard long form is our largest, most significant. Your purchase order, one that I sent. If you want to pass this down or need to pass it down, you'll see that we did not include any insurance there. Again, they're provided, but we also have our terms and conditions on an attachment. It's just more suited for that. But you'll see a standard flow, payments, invoices. Again, this is information that's all pretty consistent. So you may want to use something like this form if you buy supplies. But here's 3 examples for you. Hope you highlight, go through and highlight what it is that's important to you, what you need to be looking for. But most of what's in these documents I've provided you samples are supposed to be in other subcontracts, and you would expect to see in subcontracts. Okay. We can talk more about this on Tuesday. This is just a checklist of, we talked about your insurance, we talked about payrolls, we talked about bonds. Here's just a list of some of the things that, even though you have a contract that we've issued you subcontract, this is what you may be asked to provide in addition to that. There's a W-9 that says you pay your taxes and here's your company. We report the income, whether or not we have to have a joint agreement, a joint check agreement. So here's some of the checklists that we go through that you would say, oh, okay, I see the subcontract, but these are also required. Okay. I quickly just want to mention that again, we talked about this, is that the owner flows it down to the prime contractor flows it down to the subcontractor, which in this case would be you, if you were performing work for me. And if you had any second tier or lower tier subcontractors, you would be flowing them also down to them. It's a mandatory requirement on federal contracts. I imagine on some state requirements, it's also a lot more of the state contracts that include federal dollars have to include these clauses. You want to be watchful that some of your state contracts also include federal dollars and have federal terms. Okay, got a couple minutes for questions. I'm sorry I talked so long. I'm here for a little bit. If you have to hop off, I understand. But anybody got any questions? Anybody? Questions? Thoughts? Something's got to be burning in your desire of, I didn't understand that, or, oh my God, that seems like a lot.
Mona, you covered it so well, nobody's got questions.
Well, thank you, Terry. I was kind of thinking that maybe I talked so long, everyone fell asleep. So use these forms, use the information, highlight, look for things. Your PTAC is always available to help you understand these terms. Terry, Mary Jo, and I have got a lot of experience on working on contracts. We can help you with that. But these are the pitfalls and some of the things that you need to know if you are going to do work for a prime contractor on a federal contract. Again, they are flow down clauses. And next Tuesday, hopefully everyone will come back, we'll talk about what some of those hidden clauses or terms actually are. They're not as important as your subcontract not, I don't want to discredit that. They're important that you comply with them, but they're more business related than they are actual work related, if that makes sense. But you do want to be held accountable. You do want to be aware that you're going to be held accountable for it. So if no one has any questions, we'll sign off and we'll see you next week. So
Mona, did you want me to just hang out for a minute or?